There is a particular arrogance in believing we have finished reading a landscape simply because we have finally learned to read its writing. For nearly 2 centuries now, since the hieroglyphs of Egypt were coaxed back into meaning, we have told ourselves a comforting story. That the text explains the stone, that the inscription accounts for the monument, that between what a civilization wrote and what it built there exists a kind of settled correspondence, waiting only for sufficient scholarship to fully align. But stone does not always agree to be explained by ink. Sometimes it simply sits, indifferent to the words carved near it, holding a history in its grain and its erosion that the written record either never addressed or, more troublingly, never intended to address at all. And it is in that quiet gap between what the rock remembers and what the page admits that some of the most persistent and most carefully argued controversies in modern archaeology continue to live. The plateau at Giza in the low light of early morning does not resemble the postcard image most of the world carries in its imagination. Before the tour buses arrive, before the heat rises in visible waves off the limestone causeway, there is a stillness here that belongs less to spectacle than to geology. The pale rock catching the first flat gold of the sun at an angle that throws every fissure, every weathered groove, every centuries-old scar into sharp relief. The Great Pyramid rises at one edge of this stillness, its outer casing long since stripped away by later builders who found in it a convenient quarry, its core blocks now exposed and stepped, worn smooth in places by 100 generations of hands and feet, roughened in others by wind that has had 4,500 years to work at the surface without pause. And a short distance away, sunk below the level of the surrounding plateau in an enclosure of its own quarrying, the Great Sphinx sits facing directly east, its leonine body carved from bedrock left in place when the surrounding stone was cut away to build the temples beside it, its surface marked by a pattern of weathering that has occupied more hours of serious geological argument than perhaps any other single feature of the ancient world. That weathering is the visible, undeniable evidence at the center of this chapter's mystery. Anyone standing at the enclosure wall today can see it plainly. Deep, rounded, vertically oriented fissures cut into the limestone body of the Sphinx and the walls that surround it, a pattern of erosion that looks, to the untrained eye and, more importantly, to a number of trained geologists who have studied it closely, distinctly different from the sharp, horizontal, wind-cut striations found on the nearby tombs and temples that are confidently dated to the same era as the Sphinx's traditional construction. This is not a matter of interpretation in the way so much of ancient history is a matter of interpretation. It is a physical, measurable feature of the rock, present for any qualified observer to examine, photograph, and analyze. Evidence in the most literal sense, chiseled not by an ancient hand but by water over time into stone that has otherwise stood in the desert with almost no serious rainfall for millennia. Here is where the tension this chapter is built around begins to sharpen. The conventional archaeological chronology, resting on a substantial body of evidence, inscriptional, art historical, and contextual, places the carving of the Sphinx firmly within the reign of the 4th dynasty King Khufu, roughly 4,500 years ago, contemporaneous with the pyramid that shares his name, and stands directly behind the monument. This dating is not casual. It draws on the Sphinx's stylistic consistency with securely dated 4th dynasty royal portraiture, on its direct causeway alignment with Khufu's pyramid complex, and on the broader archaeological context of the plateau, in which every other structure of comparable scale and material belongs, without serious dispute, to this same narrow window of Old Kingdom history. Against this stands a much smaller, though persistent, body of geological argument, most closely associated with the work of a geologist who examined the enclosure walls in the late 20th century and concluded that the depth and character of the weathering pattern could only be explained by prolonged exposure to substantial rainfall, of a kind the Giza Plateau has not experienced since a much earlier and much wetter climatic period, one that would push the monument's true age back not by centuries, but by several millennia beyond its traditionally accepted construction date. The tension, in other words, is not between ignorance and knowledge. It is between two forms of evidence that refuse, so far, to fully agree with one another. The art historical and archaeological record on one hand, coherent, well contextualized, and firmly anchored in the broader chronology of Old Kingdom Egypt, and a specific physically observable geological feature on the other, whose most straightforward reading points toward a timeline the rest of the archaeological evidence does not support. Mainstream Egyptology has offered several serious responses to this discrepancy, proposing, among other explanations, that the weathering may result from long-term exposure to wind-driven sand, acting on a particularly soft and vulnerable stratum of limestone, or from millennia of burial and re-exposure, the Sphinx having spent long periods of its history buried up to its neck in sand, which itself can hold and slowly release moisture against buried stone in ways that might produce erosion patterns different from those found on structures that stood continuously exposed. These explanations are geologically plausible, and they command the support of the overwhelming majority of specialists who have examined the site. But they have not, even after decades of continued study, entirely silenced the original observation, nor produced a form of consensus so complete that the question is treated, within geology specifically, as fully closed. It is worth pausing here on the shape of this disagreement, because it illustrates something important about the limits of archaeological certainty more broadly. This is not a case, as popular treatments of forbidden archaeology sometimes frame it, of a hidden truth being suppressed by an institutional establishment unwilling to confront evidence that would overturn everything we think we know about human history. The geological argument for a substantially older Sphinx has been published, debated, and examined openly within the scientific literature for decades. It has simply not, in that same literature, succeeded in overturning the much larger and more internally consistent body of archaeological evidence that supports the conventional 4th dynasty date. Nor is this a case, on the other side, of the question being fully and finally resolved, with only fringe voices continuing to raise it. It occupies, instead, a genuinely uncomfortable middle position, a real physically observable anomaly, sitting in plain view on one of the most heavily studied monuments on Earth, that has not yet been explained with a degree of confidence sufficient to satisfy every specialist who has looked closely at the stone itself. This is, in its way, a more unsettling situation than either simple certainty or simple mystery would be. We are not missing evidence here. We are standing directly in front of it, in the clear light of the Giza morning, running a hand, if we are permitted, along grooves cut by water into rock that has otherwise known only wind and sun for longer than most of recorded history. The evidence has not been lost, buried, or suppressed. It has been examined repeatedly by qualified people working in good faith, and it has simply not yet yielded an explanation that fully closes the gap between what the stone appears to say and what the surrounding archaeological context confidently asserts. Both cannot be entirely right in their most literal reading, and archaeology, as a discipline built on the patient accumulation and reconciliation of physical evidence, has not yet finished the work of determining, with full confidence, which account will ultimately need to bend. There is a deeper and in some ways more honest way to sit with this unresolved tension, one that resists the temptation running through so much popular treatment of the subject to resolve it prematurely in either direction, neither dismissing the weathering pattern as a curiosity, unworthy of serious attention, nor inflating it into proof of a lost and vanished civilization for which no other corroborating evidence has ever been found. The honest position is simply this, that the Giza Plateau, for all the centuries of careful excavation, measurement, and translation that have been devoted to it, still contains at least one significant physical feature whose full explanation remains genuinely, actively unsettled. Not because the question has been ignored, but because the evidence itself has proven more difficult to reconcile than either side of the debate would prefer. Beneath the Sphinx and the pyramids that stand near it, moreover, lies terrain that has not been fully explored even by the standards of conventional archaeology. Chambers and passages identified through modern non-invasive scanning technology within the body of the Great Pyramid itself, voids whose function, and in some cases whose very existence, continues to be debated and re-examined using techniques that did not exist even a generation ago. Each new scanning campaign adds detail without necessarily adding certainty, confirming that the monument still holds spaces we have not entered, without yet telling us clearly what those spaces once held, or why they were built in the particular configuration the scans reveal. The plateau, in other words, remains an active site of genuine not knowing, in the most literal and defensible sense of that phrase. Not a place where answers are being hidden from us, but a place where the questions have simply, stubbornly outlasted the tools we have so far brought to bear on them. As the light shifts across the enclosure walls in the last hour before the site fills with visitors, the weathered grooves in the limestone remain exactly as they have been found, photographed, and argued over for decades, neither confirming nor denying the story we have told ourselves about when this monument came to be, indifferent, as stone tends to be, to the certainty of the people who study it. What water once moved across this plateau, and how long ago, and what the Sphinx already was or was not when it did, remains one of the plateau's genuinely open questions. A reminder that even in the most thoroughly examined places on Earth, the ground can still decline to fully agree with the history written about it, and that some part of what Giza remembers may simply be waiting, still, for a way of asking that we have not yet learned. Inside the Great Pyramid, past the low, cramped passages that visitors are permitted to climb today, and past the sections closed to the general public, the structure conceals a set of 4 narrow shafts, each roughly 20 centimeters square, 2 extending from the King's Chamber and 2 from the Queen's Chamber below it, cut through tens of meters of solid masonry at angles that were clearly calculated, not improvised. The air inside these passages is still in a way that feels almost deliberate, undisturbed by the shifting currents that move through the more heavily trafficked corridors nearby, carrying with it the particular mineral coolness of stone that has not seen open air or direct light in over 4,000 years. Dust lies undisturbed in pockets along their length, in a darkness so complete that even the small robotic cameras sent to explore them in recent decades have needed to bring their own light with them into a space that has, by any reasonable estimate, never once held illumination since the final blocks were set in place around it. 2 of these shafts, those extending from the King's Chamber, run in a relatively straight line to the pyramid's exterior surface, opening onto the monument's outer face, a fact confirmed by direct physical access, and one whose purpose seems, on its surface, comparatively straightforward, since the shaft's orientation aligns with reasonable precision towards specific points in the northern and southern sky, corresponding to stars or star groups that held documented religious significance in Old Kingdom funerary belief, including the circumpolar stars associated with eternal, unsetting existence, and the belt of Orion, linked in Egyptian religious thought to the god Osiris and, by extension, to the king's own hoped-for transformation and rebirth after death. This alignment, when it was first proposed, offered a genuinely satisfying answer. The shafts as instruments of spiritual, rather than physical, passage, channels through which the king's transfigured spirit was believed capable of traveling directly toward its intended celestial destination, bypassing entirely the long, indirect route through the pyramid's sealed internal corridors. The two shafts extending from the Queen's chamber, however, resist this same clean explanation, and it is here that the genuine, unresolved mystery of this chapter begins. Unlike their counterparts above, these lower shafts do not reach the pyramid's exterior surface. They stop, both of them, some distance short of the outer face, sealed behind what modern investigation has confirmed to be deliberately placed limestone blocks. Blocks fitted with small copper fittings, handles of a kind whose function remains debated, discovered only when a small robotic device, sent into the southern shaft in the early 1990s, reached the obstruction and transmitted back images that raised as many questions as they resolved. A second robotic expedition, roughly a decade later, drilled a small hole through this first blocking stone, only to find, on the other side, not open passage but a second stone, positioned a short distance beyond the first, its surface similarly worked, similarly deliberate, similarly sealed. This is where the physical evidence and the written record diverge most sharply, and where the tension driving this chapter comes fully into focus. We possess, in this case, direct, repeatedly confirmed physical evidence. Measured shafts, precisely oriented, deliberately constructed, deliberately blocked with worked stone at specific, apparently significant points along their length. And we possess, standing directly against that evidence, total silence from every surviving written source. No Old Kingdom text describes the purpose of these shafts. No inscription, anywhere within the pyramid or in the wider corpus of 4th Dynasty religious writing, explains why two passages would be built to align with the northern sky and reach the open air, while two others, cut with the same evident care and precision, would be built only to stop short, sealed behind stone that someone deliberately chose to leave in place. The astronomical alignment theory, elegant as it is for the upper shafts, offers no comparably satisfying account of why the builders would construct a symbolic channel toward the heavens, and then, quite literally, block it before it ever reached them. Proposed explanations range across a wide spectrum of plausibility. Some Egyptologists have suggested the blocking stones served a purely structural or symbolic function, a kind of sealed doorway representing passage without requiring actual physical opening, consistent with a broader Egyptian funerary tradition of symbolic rather than literal access points. Others have proposed that the blocks were never meant to be permanent, that they represent an intermediate stage of construction, interrupted by the king's death, or some other circumstance the historical record does not preserve, leaving the shafts in a state their builders intended eventually to complete. Still others, working from the copper fittings discovered on the first blocking stone, have speculated that the stones were designed to be removable by someone possessing the correct knowledge or tools, functioning almost as a kind of controlled access point rather than a permanent seal. Though what, exactly, that access might have been intended to permit, and to whom, remains entirely unaddressed by any surviving text. What makes this particular mystery so distinct from many others in the history of Egyptology is the sheer specificity of the unanswered question. We are not asking, broadly, what the ancient Egyptians believed about the afterlife. On that subject, as the earlier chapters of this study have traced at length, we possess an enormous and richly detailed body of surviving religious literature. We are asking something much narrower and in some ways much harder to answer. Why this particular pyramid, built for this particular king, contains 4 passages of nearly identical construction and comparable precision, 2 of which serve and function we can reasonably reconstruct from surviving religious texts, and 2 of which appear to have been deliberately, carefully prevented from serving that same function, sealed behind stone, whose placement required exactly the same skill and exactly the same evident intention as everything else in this famously precise structure. The silence is not general. It is pointed directly and frustratingly at the one detail that would resolve everything else. Successive investigations have continued in the decades since the first robotic camera reached that initial blocking stone to probe further into the mystery without yet reaching its far side. Cosmic ray muon detection, a technique borrowed from particle physics and applied to archaeology only in the past several years, has identified previously unknown voids within the pyramid's structure, including a substantial cavity above the Grand Gallery, whose function remains, as of the most recent published research, entirely undetermined. A space large enough to be architecturally significant, discovered not through excavation, but through the passive detection of subatomic particles passing through solid stone, a method the pyramid's original builders could not have anticipated in even their most speculative imagining of the future, and one that has, so far, raised the number of open questions inside this monument rather than reducing it. Standing at the base of the pyramid in the stillness of early evening, when the last tour groups have dispersed and the structure's long shadow stretches out across the plateau toward the darkening east, it is worth remembering that this monument has now stood, largely intact, for a span of time greater than the distance separating its own construction from the invention of writing itself in the region where it was built. We have measured it, scanned it, sent cameras and robots into its narrowest and darkest recesses, and reconstructed with real confidence an enormous amount about the civilization that built it. And still, somewhere inside its carefully calculated mass, 2 small stoned doors remain closed behind 2 other small stone doors, positioned by hands that knew exactly what they were sealing away, in a silence that 4,000 years of scholarship and the better part of a century of direct physical investigation has not yet found a way to fully break. Some mysteries announce themselves through what is visible above ground. Others begin only when the ground itself is opened, revealing a structure whose scale and evident purpose bear no clear relationship to anything described in the surviving textual record. The Osiris Shaft, cut into the bedrock beneath the causeway that connects the Sphinx to the second pyramid of Giza, belongs firmly to this second category, a subterranean complex whose lowest level sits below the region's water table, surrounded by water for a significant portion of its history, and whose purpose, despite direct physical access and considerable modern investigation, remains a subject of genuine scholarly disagreement. The descent into the Osiris Shaft is not, by the standards of Egyptian archaeology, an especially dramatic one in visual terms. A narrow modern staircase, installed to allow safe access for researchers and, on rare occasions, for visitors granted special permission, spirals down through roughly 30 meters of cut bedrock, the air growing noticeably cooler and heavier with each turn, the walls close enough in places to touch on both sides at once. At the bottom of this first descent lies a chamber containing a large stone sarcophagus, empty, its lid long since displaced, surrounded by a shallow moat of water that seeps continuously from the surrounding limestone, fed by the same water table that once, in antiquity, would have kept this chamber permanently, deliberately flooded. A second, deeper shaft continues downward from this level, leading to a further chamber that has been the subject of considerably more speculation than certainty, containing what several researchers who have examined it directly have described as a second sarcophagus, positioned at the center of an artificial island surrounded, once again, by water, an arrangement that bears an unmistakable, and by most Egyptological accounts entirely intentional, resemblance to Egyptian textual descriptions of the mound of creation, the primeval hill said to have emerged from the waters of chaos at the very beginning of the world, upon which the god Osiris was believed, in certain traditions, to be both buried and eternally reborn. This resemblance is the strongest evidence available for the complex's most widely accepted interpretation, that the Osiris Shaft functioned as a symbolic tomb, or cenotaph, dedicated to Osiris specifically, its architecture deliberately constructed to physically embody, in cut stone and controlled water, a central image from Egyptian creation mythology. This reading has real explanatory power, and it accounts reasonably well for the complex's most distinctive physical features. The water, the central island, the sarcophagus positioned upon it in a configuration that would have made genuine, practical burial in the ordinary sense entirely impractical, given the chamber's permanent proximity to groundwater. If the goal was symbolic representation rather than functional interment, the water is not an obstacle to be explained away. It is the entire point. And yet, the dating of this remarkable structure and the precise nature of its use across time resist the same confidence that its symbolic interpretation has achieved. The shaft's uppermost level shows clear evidence of construction and modification across multiple periods of Egyptian history, complicating any simple assignment of the entire complex to a single dynasty or a single moment of intentional design. Pottery and other datable material recovered from within the shaft point most strongly towards significant activity during the late period, roughly 2,000 years after the construction of the Sphinx and pyramids. The shaft sits directly beneath, suggesting either that the complex was built entirely during this later period, considerably closer to the Roman era than to the Old Kingdom, or, in a competing and more contested interpretation, that an earlier structure, potentially contemporary with the plateau's original 4th dynasty construction, was substantially reused, reworked, and reinterpreted by later generations of Egyptians who recognized in its existing form a resonance with their own evolving religious symbolisms surrounding Osiris and the primeval mound. This is where the conflict between evidence and silence sharpens into genuine, unresolved disagreement among specialists. The physical structure is direct, tangible, and available for inspection. Visitors granted access can walk its passages, observe its water, and examine its sarcophagi with their own eyes, in a way that leaves no doubt about the complex's existence or its evident, careful construction. What remains contested is not whether the shaft exists, but when its earliest phase was cut, and by whom, and for what specific purpose at that earliest moment. Questions the surviving material culture answers only partially, and the surviving written record, which contains no clear contemporary description of the shaft's construction or intended use at any period, does not answer at all. We are left, once again, in the now familiar position of holding the artifact directly in hand while the explanation for it remains, best, a matter of careful inference rather than confirmed fact. What deepens the mystery further is the complex, persistent association, in more recent decades, with a body of alternative and considerably more speculative theorizing that has grown up around the Giza plateau generally. Claims, largely unsupported by the archaeological evidence gathered from the shaft itself, connecting the structure to lost technologies, hidden chambers of vast antiquity, civilizations for which no independent corroborating evidence has been recovered anywhere else on the plateau or beyond it. It is worth stating plainly that the shaft's genuine, well-documented mystery, its uncertain dating, its ambiguous relationship to the Old Kingdom monuments above it, the real scholarly disagreement over whether its earliest phase predates or postdates the pyramids by centuries or by millennia, is considerably more interesting and more intellectually honest than the more elaborate speculative narratives that have sometimes attached themselves to the site in popular treatment. The genuine unresolved question does not require exaggeration to remain compelling. It is enough, on its own terms, that a structure this deliberately built, this evidently significant to whoever constructed and later maintained it, continues to resist confident placement within the historical timeline of the civilization that surrounds it on every side. Standing at the base of the lower chamber, where the water that has occupied this space for who knows how many centuries laps quietly against stone cut by hands, whose names and whose century of work remain. Even now, a matter of ongoing academic argument, it is difficult not to feel the particular vertigo this study has returned to again and again. The sensation of standing directly beside an answer that refuses, despite every modern tool brought to bear upon it, to fully resolve itself. The Osiris Shaft asks a deceptively simple question that the plateau above it has not yet found a way to answer with full confidence. Not what this place meant, which the water and the island and the sarcophagus argue for with real persuasive force, but when it first came to mean it, and whether the hands that first cut this shaft into the bedrock beneath Khafre's causeway were guided by an intention already thousands of years old at the moment of its carving, or one still being newly imagined in stone and standing water by a much later Egypt looking back at its own increasingly distant beginnings. Not every mystery at Giza concerns what a structure meant. Some concern the far more practical, and in their own way equally unresolved, question of how it was built at all. A question that finds its most complete and most physically direct evidence, not within a chamber of painted or inscribed stone, but disassembled, patiently, board by board, in a sealed pit beside the Great Pyramid, where a fully constructed cedar vessel waited in darkness for over 4,000 years before a single hand touched it again. In 1954, workers clearing debris along the southern base of the Great Pyramid uncovered the sealed edges of a rectangular pit cut directly into the bedrock, covered by a series of massive limestone blocks so precisely fitted that the seal beneath them had remained remarkably airtight for the entire span of time since its closure. When the pit was finally opened, what lay beneath was not treasure in the conventional sense, and not a burial, but something in its own way more startling. Over 1,200 individual pieces of cedar wood, along with rope, matting, and fittings, disassembled with evident care and arranged in a specific, deliberate sequence, waiting, it would eventually become clear, to be reassembled into a full-sized wooden vessel over 40 meters long. The reconstruction, undertaken with painstaking care over more than a decade, by a restorer working essentially as a detective, piecing together a sealed and ancient puzzle whose original assembly instructions no longer existed in any written form, produced what is now known as the Khufu ship, a vessel of extraordinary sophistication, built using construction techniques including a method of joining planks with rope lashings through a system of mortises rather than metal fastenings that demonstrate a level of maritime engineering skill that stands in some tension with the broader, more fragmentary understanding of Old Kingdom shipbuilding preserved in surviving contemporary texts. The ship itself, now displayed in a purpose-built museum near the pyramid it was buried beside, is not a reconstruction built from partial or ambiguous evidence, in the way so much of ancient technology must be inferred from indirect traces. It is, in the most literal sense available to archaeology, the original object, the actual wood, the actual rope, the actual craftsmanship of 4th dynasty shipbuilders, preserved in a completeness that almost no other artifact of comparable age and material anywhere in the ancient world can match. And this completeness is precisely what makes the silence surrounding it so pronounced. We possess the vessel itself, intact enough to sail, in principle, on the river it was built beside. We do not possess any contemporary written account explaining in incomparable detail how such a vessel came to be constructed, what specific tools and techniques its builders employed, beyond what can be reverse engineered from the wood itself, or the question that has generated the most sustained scholarly disagreement, what its intended function actually was. The most widely accepted interpretation holds that the Khufu ship served a solar religious purpose, intended to carry the king's transfigured spirit alongside the sun god on his eternal daily journey across the sky, consistent with broader Old Kingdom beliefs about the king's identification with and eventual union with the solar deity after death. This interpretation draws support from the ship's careful, ritual burial directly beside the pyramid, sealed with the same precision and evident reverence given to other elements of the king's funerary provisioning, and from broader textual evidence, including passages within the pyramid texts discussed earlier in this study, describing the deceased king's expected celestial voyage in language that resonates with the presence of an actual physical boat positioned to accompany him. But a second, considerably more practically minded interpretation has never been fully set aside, and the evidence does not clearly favor one reading over the other with the finality a resolved question would require. Some Egyptologists have proposed that the vessel, or at least the type of vessel it represents, may have served an entirely functional purpose during the king's lifetime, or during his funeral itself, potentially used to transport the king's body, or elements of his funerary procession, along the Nile from wherever his death occurred to the burial site at Giza, only afterward being disassembled and interred as a final act of ritual provisioning, rather than having been built from the outset purely as a symbolic, never-to-be-sailed object. Subtle evidence recovered from the wood itself, signs of wear on certain fittings, patterns of use that some researchers have argued are inconsistent with a vessel built and buried without ever touching water, has been cited in support of this reading, though other specialists examining the same evidence have reached the opposite conclusion, arguing that the marks in question are equally consistent with careful construction and ritual assembly rather than genuine practical use. The disagreement here, unlike some of the mysteries this study has traced, is not a disagreement over an absence of context. We know a great deal about Old Kingdom funerary practice, about the broader religious framework within which a king's burial was understood and organized, about the general contours of 4th dynasty maritime technology, as reconstructed from this and other more fragmentary vessel remains recovered elsewhere on the plateau. What we lack is something narrower and, in its way, more frustrating. A direct textual bridge connecting this specific, extraordinarily well-preserved object to a specific, explicitly stated account of its intended purpose, written by someone who actually knew, at the time of its burial, why it had been built and disassembled in precisely this manner. The ship survived. The explanation, if it was ever written down at all, did not. A second, still sealed pit, positioned symmetrically alongside the one that yielded the Khufu ship, was identified decades ago and confirmed through careful, non-invasive investigation, including a small camera inserted through a drilled opening to contain a second, similarly disassembled vessel, its wood in a notably more deteriorated condition than its counterpart, likely owing to a less perfect seal having allowed air and moisture to reach it across the intervening centuries. This second boat remains, as of the most recent published research on the subject, still largely in place. Its full excavation and reconstruction a project that would require resources and conservation expertise comparable to what the first ship's decade-long restoration demanded, meaning that a second, complete physical answer to at least some of the questions this chapter has raised may already be sitting, disassembled and waiting, in the ground beside the pyramid, its planks and lashings, holding whatever additional evidence they hold in a darkness that has not yet, by deliberate and cautious choice, been fully disturbed. There is something quietly appropriate in the fact that one of the most complete artifacts to survive from the entire span of ancient Egyptian civilization is also one of its most genuinely ambiguous. In purpose, a vessel intact enough, in principle, to carry a crew across open water, built by craftsmen whose names we will never know, sealed by a religious logic we can only partially reconstruct, and set to wait in darkness beside a monument that has itself resisted full explanation for as long as anyone has seriously tried to provide one. The wood survived the 4,500 years its builders could not have anticipated it would need to endure. What did not survive, in any form the historical record preserves, was the single sentence that might have settled, once and for all, whether this ship was ever meant to feel water beneath it in the world of the living, or whether it was built, from its very first cut plank, only ever to sail in the sky. Some archaeological debates are not about missing evidence, but about how much weight a small amount of evidence is capable of carrying. Few disputes in the study of Old Kingdom Egypt illustrate this problem more precisely than the discovery. Deep within the relieving chambers above the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, of a scatter of red ochre quarry marks, informal, workaday inscriptions, left not by priests or scribes composing sacred text, but by ordinary construction crews, marking their work in the one place they had every reason to believe no one would ever read it again. Access to the relieving chambers above the king's chamber remains, even today, tightly restricted, available only to researchers granted specific institutional permission, reached through a narrow, cramped ascent that most visitors to the pyramid never see and could not, in any case, physically undertake. Within these low, dust-choked spaces, built to redistribute the enormous weight of stone pressing down from above the burial chamber, the surfaces of certain blocks bear the marks left by the work gangs who quarried and moved them. Hastily painted hieroglyphic notations in red ochre, never intended for a formal, visible audience, recording the name of the specific work crew responsible for a given block, and, in the most significant instance for this chapter's purposes, a cartouche identifying the reigning king, under whose authority the work was being carried out. That cartouche names Khufu, the same king traditionally credited with commissioning the Great Pyramid as a whole, and its discovery, first noted by early explorers in the 19th century and confirmed repeatedly by subsequent investigation, has long stood as one of the most direct pieces of physical evidence connecting this specific monument to this specific ruler. The physical fact of these markings is not in serious dispute among mainstream Egyptologists. They have been examined, photographed, and cross-referenced against other securely dated 4th dynasty inscriptions extensively enough that their basic authenticity and period of origin are treated as well established within the field. What remains a genuine subject of ongoing, occasionally sharp scholarly discussion is a narrower and more methodologically interesting question. How much interpretive weight a small number of informal, functional work crew markings, found in a space never intended for permanent display or religious function, can reasonably bear as evidence for the pyramid's overall construction history, given that they represent, in the end, only a handful of brief notations from crews responsible for a small fraction of the monument's total mass, rather than a comprehensive contemporary account of the project as a whole. This is a subtler form of the tension this study has traced throughout, and it is worth sitting with precisely because it resists the more dramatic framing that popular treatment sometimes imposes on it. The question is not whether Khufu's name appears within the pyramid. It plainly, verifiably does. The question is what that appearance can and cannot tell us with confidence. It confirms, reasonably securely, that construction activity connected to Khufu's reign was underway on at least this portion of the structure. It does not, on its own, fully resolve more granular questions that continue to occupy specialists, including the precise duration of the overall building project, the exact organization and scale of the labor force involved, beyond what can be inferred from the settlement remains of the workers' village excavated to the south of the plateau, or the complete sequence in which different sections of this famously complex structure were designed, quarried, and assembled. The marks are genuine, direct physical evidence. They are also, by their very nature, as brief and informal notations never intended for later scholarly scrutiny, a narrower window onto the full history of the monument's construction than the confidence with which they are sometimes cited in popular summary would suggest. There is a further, more pointed layer to this discussion that has surfaced periodically within specialist circles and occasionally in public debate as well. A small number of researchers and commentators outside the Egyptological mainstream have, over the decades, questioned the authenticity of these specific markings, suggesting they might represent a later addition rather than an original 4th dynasty inscription. This claim has been examined directly and repeatedly by specialists with access to the chambers, who point to the markings' consistent stylistic and paleographic alignment with other securely dated 4th dynasty material. Their presence in locations that would have been completely sealed and inaccessible from the time of the pyramid's completion until the chambers were first opened by modern investigators, and the absence of any plausible motive or opportunity for a later forger to have accessed and altered surfaces that no one outside a small circle of 19th and 20th century researchers has ever been positioned to reach. The authenticity question, examined on its actual evidentiary merits, does not carry serious weight within the field. But its persistence in public discussion decades after it was first raised and addressed, speaks to something this study has returned to throughout: the way in which genuine, narrow, methodologically interesting uncertainty within a discipline can, once it reaches a wider audience, sometimes harden into a much larger and less careful claim than the original specialist discussion ever supported. What remains when the exaggerated version of this dispute is set aside is a smaller but still genuinely interesting problem: the recognition that even our most direct, most physically unambiguous evidence for who built the Great Pyramid and under whose authority rests on a smaller body of primary material than the monument's fame might lead a casual observer to assume. We do not possess, from Khufu's own reign, a detailed contemporary building record explaining the project's full logistics in the way, for instance, that certain later Egyptian construction projects are documented through surviving administrative papyri. We possess the monument itself, overwhelming in scale and precision, and a comparatively modest scatter of informal functional markings connecting it to his name, along with the broader circumstantial weight of its location, its stylistic and architectural relationship to other securely dated 4th dynasty structures, and the testimony, centuries later, of Egyptian and Greek historical tradition identifying Khufu as its builder. Taken together, this evidence supports the conventional attribution with real and reasonable confidence. It does not, however, offer the kind of exhaustive, self-explaining documentary certainty that the sheer scale and fame of the pyramid might lead an outside observer to expect it should. In the narrow, dust-heavy silence of the relieving chambers, where almost no visitor will ever stand, and where the air itself carries a stillness that feels older than the light brought in to examine it, the red ochre marks left by anonymous quarry workers remain exactly where they were painted, in haste, by men who had no reason to imagine their brief functional notation would still be debated, photographed, and argued over more than 4,000 years after they set down their brushes and returned to the ordinary, unrecorded business of their working lives. They are not proof of everything the pyramid still withholds. They are proof only of what they were always modest enough to claim: a name, a crew, a moment of labor, preserved by accident in a space built never to be seen again, standing now as one of the very few places within this entire overwhelming monument where the ordinary hands that built it left behind something we can still, with real if bounded confidence, call their own. Every study of this kind must eventually confront the difference between a mystery that will one day be solved and a mystery that may simply outlast every method we currently possess for solving it. Giza, after nearly 2 centuries of the most sustained and well-resourced archaeological attention given to any single site on Earth, offers examples of both, and standing, finally, at the edge of the plateau as this study draws to its close, it is worth asking plainly which of its remaining questions belong to which category, and what that distinction actually means for how we ought to hold the uncertainty that remains. The plateau at dusk empties gradually rather than all at once, the last organized tour groups filing back toward the gates as the light drops into the long amber angle that photographers wait all day to capture, the pyramids themselves shifting from pale gold to a deeper, almost bronze tone as the sun drops toward the western desert behind them. In this final hour, before the site closes fully and the desert reclaims, for a few hours, its older and more essential silence, it becomes easier to see the plateau not as a single monument, but as a landscape still under active investigation. Cordoned excavation areas visible at its margins, survey equipment left in place overnight, beside trenches not yet fully documented, evidence everywhere one looks, that the work of understanding this place remains genuinely unfinished rather than merely awaiting popular rediscovery of answers long since settled by specialists. Because this is, in the end, the most important distinction this chapter can offer, and the one most often lost in less careful treatments of forbidden or alternative archaeology. The unresolved questions this study has traced across its preceding chapters are not evidence of a suppressed or hidden truth, deliberately withheld by an institutional archaeology unwilling to confront what it might reveal. They are evidence, instead, of the ordinary and honest limits of a discipline working with genuinely difficult material, evidence eroded by time, evidence sealed behind stone that cannot always be opened without risking the destruction of what lies beyond it. Evidence that survives in such fragmentary and uneven quantity that even the most rigorous and good faith reconstruction must, at some point, reach the edge of what the remaining material can support and stop there honestly, rather than filling the remaining silence with a confidence the evidence does not earn. And yet acknowledging this honest limit is not the same as dismissing the genuine strangeness that remains. The weathering on the Sphinx enclosure walls has not been fully, conclusively explained in a way that satisfies every geologist who has examined it closely. The sealed shafts within the Great Pyramid still end in stone whose far side no camera has yet fully documented. The dating of the Osiris Shaft's earliest phase remains a matter of real, ongoing specialist disagreement rather than settled consensus. The full purpose of the Khufu ship and the contents of its still largely unexcavated companion vessel remain open in ways that direct physical access to the objects themselves has not yet resolved. Each of these represents not a failure of archaeology, but a fair and accurate accounting of where the discipline's current evidence genuinely runs out. A boundary that continued excavation, continued analysis, and continued technological advancement from muon detection to increasingly sophisticated dating techniques has moved outward substantially over the past several decades and will likely continue to move outward gradually in the decades still to come. What this study has tried to resist across all 6 of its chapters is the temptation running through so much popular engagement with this material to treat every remaining gap in our knowledge as evidence of a hidden, more dramatic truth waiting just beyond the reach of conventional scholarship. A temptation that, however understandable as a response to genuine and well-documented uncertainty, tends in practice to substitute a more comfortable kind of story for the harder, more honest work of sitting with questions that may simply not yet, or may never, be fully answerable. The plateau does not require exaggeration to remain genuinely mysterious. It is mysterious enough, examined carefully and honestly on its own considerable terms, in the precise and specific ways this study has tried to trace. There is finally a particular kind of humility that this landscape seems designed to teach anyone willing to spend enough time within it. Not the humility of ignorance, since we know, in real and hard-won detail, an enormous amount about the civilization that built these monuments, the tools it used, the beliefs that likely animated its labor, the political and religious structures that made a project of this scale conceivable in the first place. It is, instead, the humility of incompleteness, the recognition that even the most thoroughly studied, most extensively excavated, most confidently dated site on Earth still holds sealed passages, still holds disagreements among the very specialists best equipped to resolve them, still holds artifacts pulled intact from beneath the sand that continue, decades after their recovery, to resist a single, fully settled account of their purpose. As the last light drains from the western sky and the pyramids, settle into the deep blue silhouette they hold through the desert night. It is worth remembering that this plateau has now watched over roughly 180 human generations pass beneath it, each one arriving with its own tools, its own questions, its own conviction that it might finally be the generation to fully close the distance between the stone and the story. Some of that distance has closed genuinely and durably, through patient, careful work conducted across 2 centuries of modern archaeological practice. Some of it remains exactly as open as it was when the first serious investigators began their work here. Not because the truth has been hidden from us, but because some truths, sealed deeply enough, in stone precise enough, by builders skilled enough, simply take longer than 2 centuries, or perhaps longer than any span of time we are yet positioned to guarantee, to finally, fully give themselves back.